March 17, 1943, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Hartley's Pharmacy on 5th Avenue, Oakland District. Pharmacist Estelle Vogel looked down at the prescription slip and felt her breath catch. In 22 years behind the counter, she had dispensed thousands of medications. But this particular drug combination appeared on her order pad maybe 4 times total. Chloral hydrate syrup, maximum strength, quantity 6 bottles. The woman standing at the counter was somewhere in her 60s, wearing a threadbare wool coat that had seen better days and clutching a cracked leather handbag. Her face carried an expression of vacant patience, but her fingers, wrapped tight around the handbag clasp, trembled almost imperceptibly. Estelle read the prescription again. The physician's signature was Dr. Elwood Percival Whitmore. The clinic stamp looked legitimate. The date was current. Everything appeared in order. But something felt profoundly wrong. Chloral hydrate in these doses was typically reserved for severe insomnia cases or pre-surgical sedation in hospital settings, not for home use in such quantities. "Did Dr. Whitmore explain the dosing schedule to you?" Estelle asked, keeping her tone neutral but firm. "He explained everything," the woman replied. Her voice came out hoarse, worn down like sandpaper. "I understand perfectly." Estelle filled the prescription, completed the documentation, and watched the woman exit into the Pittsburgh afternoon, where March wind carried coal smoke and the perpetual industrial haze that hung over the city. The customer disappeared into the crowd of defense workers heading home from the day shift. Estelle returned to her work, but the strange prescription nagged at her consciousness. She copied Dr. Whitmore's name and the clinic address into her personal ledger, just as a precaution. She didn't know then that this same woman would return exactly 1 month later, that within 6 months, Estelle would be sitting in a Federal Bureau of Investigation field office giving testimony about what she'd witnessed. That some truths, once known, shatter your understanding of the world you've inhabited your entire life. Estelle Vogel was born in 1901 in Philadelphia to German immigrant parents. Her father, a watchmaker, died of influenza during the Great Pandemic of 1918 when Estelle was 17. Her mother worked in a textile mill, 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. After graduating from girls' high school, Estelle attended the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy, one of the few women in her class. She excelled in chemistry and pharmacology, graduating in 1921 at age 20. Her first position was at a small pharmacy in South Philadelphia, where she learned the business from the ground up. Compounding medications, managing inventory, dealing with difficult customers and dismissive physicians who didn't take kindly to a young woman questioning their prescriptions. In 1925, at 24, she married Morton Vogel, an accountant for a steel company. The marriage was companionable rather than passionate. Morton was steady, reliable, utterly predictable. They moved to Pittsburgh in 1926 when his firm transferred him to their headquarters. Estelle found work at Hartley's Pharmacy, a well-established business in Oakland, the neighborhood that housed the University of Pittsburgh and several major hospitals. The location was ideal. Constant foot traffic, a diverse clientele ranging from university students to hospital staff to working-class families from the surrounding streets. She and Morton tried for children, but none came. The doctors offered no explanations, just shrugs and vague reassurances that sometimes these things happened. By 1935, they'd stopped trying. Morton threw himself into his work. Estelle did the same. The pharmacy became her life, the familiar ritual of filling prescriptions, counseling customers, maintaining relationships with the local physicians. She knew her regulars intimately. Mrs. Kowalski, who needed digitalis for her heart. Mr. Chen, who required eye drops for glaucoma. The Rosenberg twins, who suffered from chronic asthma. December 7th, 1941 changed everything, as it did for everyone. Pearl Harbor meant war, and war meant transformation. Pittsburgh, already an industrial powerhouse, became the arsenal of democracy. The steel mills ran around the clock. Defense plants sprouted across the region. The city filled with newcomers seeking war work, Appalachian migrants, Southern blacks fleeing Jim Crow, women entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Rationing began. Certain medications became scarce. Estelle learned to navigate the complex web of ration stamps, priority certifications, and government regulations that now govern pharmaceutical distribution. Morton tried to enlist despite being 42, but the Army rejected him due to high blood pressure. He took it hard, felt diminished. He began drinking more heavily, became distant and irritable. Estelle stopped trying to reach him. They lived as polite strangers sharing a house on Ellsworth Avenue. The pharmacy was her refuge, her purpose. In wartime, medical personnel were essential workers, respected and valued. Estelle wore her white pharmacist's coat with quiet pride, understanding that her work contributed to the war effort in its own way, keeping the civilian population healthy, ensuring defense workers got the medications they needed to stay on the job. April 17, 1943. Exactly 1 month after the first visit, the elderly woman returned. Estelle recognized her immediately. The same threadbare coat, the same cracked handbag, the same hollow-eyed expression. The woman slid a prescription across the counter without speaking. Estelle picked it up and felt ice water flood her veins. Same medication, same strength, same quantity. Chloral hydrate syrup, 6 bottles. Written by Dr. Whitmore, same clinic stamp. Date, April 14, 1943. Estelle said carefully. The woman said, not meeting Estelle's eyes, "Just fill it, please." "I need to understand the medical necessity," Estelle pressed. "This is a controlled substance. I'm required to exercise professional judgment about whether—" "I have a prescription," the woman interrupted, and now there was an edge to her voice. Sharp, almost desperate. "A legitimate prescription from a licensed physician. You have to fill it." Technically, the woman was correct. The prescription was properly written, properly signed, properly dated. Estelle had no legal grounds to refuse. But every instinct screamed at her that this was wrong. Chloral hydrate in such quantities, obtained monthly, this wasn't treatment. This was something else entirely. She filled the prescription, documented everything, copied the details into her ledger again. After the woman left, Estelle retrieved the Oakland telephone directory and found the listing for Whitmore's clinic on Center Avenue. She stared at the number for a long time, then picked up the pharmacy's telephone and dialed. __quote _11 _____. A woman's voice answered. "Good afternoon. I'm calling to verify that Dr. Elwood Whitmore is on staff at your facility." "Dr. Whitmore? Yes, he's one of our physicians. General practice. Is there a problem?" "No problem. I'm a pharmacist confirming a prescription. Could you tell me, does Dr. Whitmore frequently prescribe chloral hydrate for home use?" There was a pause. "Ma'am, I can't discuss specific prescribing patterns over the telephone. If you have concerns about a prescription, you'd need to speak with Dr. Whitmore directly." Estelle thanked her and hung up. She'd reached a dead end. The prescription was legitimate. The doctor existed. Everything appeared above board. But that internal alarm kept ringing. She decided to wait. If the woman came back a third time, that would be the moment to act. Because no legitimate medical condition required 6 bottles of heavy sedative every single month. Early May 1943. Pittsburgh was deep into wartime rhythm, transformed into something both familiar and alien. The steel mills belched fire and smoke 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. From her apartment window, Estelle could see the orange glow of the blast furnaces reflecting off the low clouds, turning the night sky the color of burning copper. The mills never stopped now. 3 shifts, around the clock, pouring steel for ships, tanks, artillery shells. The Monongahela River ran red with iron oxide runoff. The air tasted of metal and coal smoke. Streetcars packed with defense workers ran constant routes, so crowded that people hung from the running boards. The faces changed every week. New arrivals from Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, West Virginia, all seeking war work. Women in coveralls and headscarves, carrying lunch pails, heading to welding jobs that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. Black families from the Deep South, fleeing Jim Crow for industrial wages, cramming into overcrowded housing in the Hill District. The city's population had swelled by nearly 200,000 since Pearl Harbor. Rationing had tightened with each passing month. Meat, sugar, butter, coffee, gasoline, all required stamps from ration books. Estelle had grown accustomed to the elaborate calculus of points and coupons. The pharmacy sold Victory Garden seeds, and she kept a small plot herself in the vacant lot behind her apartment building, growing tomatoes and beans. The black market thrived, of course. There were always ways to get butter or coffee if you knew the right people and had the cash. But most people made do with substitutes. Margarine instead of butter, chicory instead of coffee, stretching meat with beans and potatoes. The newspapers carried lists of local boys killed or missing in action. North Africa, Sicily, the Pacific Islands. Gold star flags appeared in more windows every week. Estelle knew several families on her block who'd lost sons. The Kowalski boy, killed at Guadalcanal. The Rosenberg twins, both missing after their ship was torpedoed. The Henderson kid, barely 19, killed in a training accident at Fort Benning. The war had an insatiable appetite. Victory Gardens sprouted in every vacant lot. Scrap metal drives emptied attics and basements. Children collected newspapers, tin cans, rubber bands. Everything could be recycled for the war effort. The entire city hummed with frenetic energy, equal parts productivity and anxiety. There was pride in the work, in the sense of contributing to the fight against Hitler and Tojo. But there was also exhaustion, worry, the constant low-grade fear that came from reading casualty lists and wondering whose son or husband would be next. Estelle worked her usual hours, 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, half-day Saturdays, closed Sundays. The pharmacy stayed busy. People needed medications for everything: headaches from stress, stomach problems from rationed food, sleeping pills to cope with worry about sons and husbands overseas. Estelle filled prescriptions, answered questions, offered what comfort she could. She'd become a fixture in the neighborhood, a steady presence in uncertain times. Morton's drinking had worsened. He'd been let go from the steel company, officially a reorganization, but everyone knew it was the drinking. He found work keeping books for a scrap metal dealer, a significant step down. He came home late now, reeking of bourbon, muttering about indignities. Estelle stopped engaging. She kept to her own life, her own routines. The marriage was a shell, but divorce was unthinkable, socially, financially, practically. They coexisted. May 15th, 1943, a Saturday, late afternoon. The pharmacy was nearly empty when the woman walked in. Estelle knew before the woman even approached the counter. Third time. 3 months in a row. Same prescription, same drug, same quantity. The woman extended the paper slip with a hand that shook noticeably now. Estelle took the prescription and read it, though she already knew what it would say. Chloral hydrate syrup, 6 bottles. Doctor. Whitmore's signature. Date, May 12, 1943. Estelle said quietly but firmly. The woman's face went white. What? You have to. I have a prescription. 18 bottles of chloral hydrate in 3 months, Estelle said, keeping her voice level. That's not treatment. That's either severe misuse or something worse. Tell me what this is really for, or I'm contacting the clinic directly. The woman's composure cracked. Her lips trembled. Her eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then words came tumbling out in a rush. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 21, underscore, underscore. Estelle studied the woman's face and didn't believe a single word. Encephalitis lethargica survivors didn't require monthly supplies of chloral hydrate. The condition didn't work that way. The woman was lying. Badly. Desperately. Estelle made a decision. Quote, 22. The woman's face collapsed. She grabbed the prescription back, shoved it into her handbag, and fled the pharmacy without another word. Estelle watched her go, then immediately locked the front door, flipped the closed sign, and returned to the telephone. She called the Oakland Community Clinic. The receptionist was the same woman from before. "This is Estelle Vogel from Hartley's Pharmacy. I need to speak with Dr. Whitmore immediately. It's urgent." "Dr. Whitmore has left for the day. He won't be back until Monday morning." "Then give me his home telephone number." "I'm not authorized to—" "Listen to me carefully," Estelle said, and there was steel in her voice now. "I have reason to believe that prescriptions bearing Dr. Whitmore's signature are being used for purposes other than legitimate medical treatment. If you don't put me in contact with him immediately, my next call is to the police. Your choice." There was a long silence. Then, "Hold the line." 3 minutes later, a man's voice came on. __quote _31 __. Estelle explained the situation. The 3 identical prescriptions, the woman's evasive answers, the implausible story about encephalitis lethargica. Dr. Whitmore listened, and then his voice changed, became sharp with alarm. "I never wrote those prescriptions," he said. "Chloral hydrate? 6 bottles? Absolutely not. I would never prescribe that for home use, and certainly not in those quantities." Estelle's hands went cold. Estelle described her: approximate age, build, clothing, mannerisms. Dr. Whitmore was silent for a long moment, then said something that made Estelle's blood run cold. "That sounds like Dorothea Claiborne. She was a patient of mine years ago, before the war. I treated her for anxiety and mild depression. She knows my handwriting. She's seen my prescription pad. God almighty, if she's forging my signature—" He trailed off, then spoke with urgency. "You need to contact the authorities, not the local police. This could involve interstate criminal activity. Call the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office. I'll meet you there within the hour." Estelle hung up and stood frozen for a moment, processing. Forged prescriptions. 18 bottles of heavy sedative. A granddaughter who supposedly had encephalitis lethargica. What was Dorothea Claiborne doing with all that chloral hydrate? Estelle felt sick. She knew what the drug did. It induced deep, prolonged sleep. In high doses or extended use, it could cause dependency, cognitive impairment, even death. She picked up the telephone again and called the operator. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Pittsburgh field office, please." Within 2 hours, Estelle was sitting in a Stark government office on 6th Avenue, giving her statement to Special Agent Harold Dempsey, a thin, intense man in his mid-30s. Dr. Whitmore sat beside her, his face grave. Estelle produced her ledger with all the copied prescription details. She described Dorothea Claiborne in as much detail as she could recall. Agent Dempsey took notes, asked sharp questions, examined the ledger entries. "Do you know where Mrs. Claiborne lives?" he asked. Estelle shook her head. "The prescriptions don't have addresses. I only have the clinic stamp." "Doctor," Whitmore spoke up. "I still have her old patient file. I can get you her last known address." "Do that immediately," Dempsey said. "Mrs. Vogel, you mentioned she claimed to have a granddaughter with sleeping sickness. Do you know the granddaughter's name?" "She never mentioned a name." "Did Mrs. Claiborne come in alone all 3 times?" "Yes, always alone." Dempsey made more notes. "Here's what concerns me. Chloral hydrate is being diverted in large quantities. Either Mrs. Claiborne is using it herself, which would likely have killed her by now, or she's giving it to someone else. If there really is a granddaughter, and she's being kept sedated without proper medical supervision—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "Doctor." Whitmore returned to his clinic and retrieved Dorothea Claiborne's file. The address listed was 847 Warwick Street, Homewood District. Agent Dempsey made telephone calls, checked records. Within an hour, he had additional information. Dorothea Claiborne, age 64, widowed. No known granddaughters. No known living relatives at all, according to census records and Social Security files. Dempsey said grimly. It was past 8 in the evening by then. Dempsey made the decision to wait until morning. Going in at night with no concrete evidence would be premature. He instructed Estelle to call immediately if Dorothea Claiborne appeared at the pharmacy again. He thanked Dr. Whitmore for his cooperation. Estelle went home, but she didn't sleep. She lay awake next to Morton's snoring form, staring at the ceiling, imagining scenarios. A young woman somewhere, kept unconscious. A prisoner. The thought made her physically ill. The next morning, Sunday, May 16th, Estelle was washing breakfast dishes when her telephone rang. It was Agent Dempsey, and she could hear the controlled urgency in his voice. Quote 50, quote, he said. Quote 51, quote. Estelle's hands were shaking as she hung up the telephone. She told Morton she had an emergency. He barely looked up from his newspaper, bourbon already on his breath at 9 in the morning, and took the streetcar downtown to the FBI office on 6th Avenue. The ride seemed to take forever, the streetcar lurching and stopping, passengers getting on and off, the mundane Sunday morning routine continuing while Estelle's mind raced with horrific images. At the field office, Agent Dempsey ushered her into a conference room. He looked like he hadn't slept. His tie was loosened, his shirt rumpled, his eyes red-rimmed. He poured her a cup of terrible government coffee and sat down across from her, a thick file folder on the table between them. Before we take your formal statement, I want to tell you what we found, he said. You deserve to know what your vigilance uncovered. He opened the folder and began laying out photographs. Crime scene photographs. Estelle forced herself to look, though her stomach turned. The house at 847 Warwick Street was a two-story wood frame structure, probably built around 1910, located in a neighborhood that had seen better days. Many of the surrounding houses were vacant, windows broken, yards overgrown. Wartime housing shortages meant that even decrepit properties found tenants, but this particular block seemed to have been largely abandoned. The perfect place to hide something. The exterior photograph showed a house with peeling paint, sagging porch, windows covered with blackout curtains that had been left up long after regulations requiring them had been relaxed. The curtains were significant. They meant no one could see in, and more importantly, no one inside could signal out. The interior photographs were worse. The downstairs was sparsely furnished, a threadbare sofa, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a small coal stove for heat. Everything looked shabby, neglected. The kitchen had a sink, an old icebox, a hot plate. Almost no food in the cupboards. The whole house had an air of temporary occupancy, as if Dorothea Claiborne was camping there rather than living there. Then, the upstairs photographs. Agent Dempsey pointed to the bedroom door. Someone had installed a heavy deadbolt on the outside, new hardware, recently added, completely incongruous with the rest of the decrepit house. The door frame showed fresh screw holes, unpainted wood where the bolt had been mounted. We had to break through, Dempsey said. Mrs. Claiborne claimed she'd lost the key, but we found it in her apron pocket. The bedroom itself was a vision of horror dressed up as care. A double bed with a stained mattress, rumpled sheets that looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks. A small nightstand with a lamp. A dresser with a few items of women's clothing, all cheap and ill-fitting. And lined up on the windowsill, like a grotesque pharmacy display, 17 empty bottles of chloral hydrate syrup. The agents had counted them. 17 bottles, Dempsey said. You dispensed 3 prescriptions, 18 bottles total. She was almost through the supply. In the photographs, Estelle could see the young woman on the bed, Vivian Marsh, though they didn't know her name yet. She was lying on her back, arms at her sides, wearing a faded cotton nightgown. Her face was so pale it looked nearly transparent, her lips bloodless. Her dark hair was matted and dirty. She looked like a corpse, except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Dempsey said. Estelle found she couldn't speak. She stared at the photograph of Vivian's unconscious face and felt tears running down her cheeks. Dempsey continued, his voice carefully neutral, laying out facts like evidence cards. Quote 60. Quote, he pulled out another photograph. Quote 61. Quote, it was a photograph of a girl of perhaps 16 or 17, standing in front of a white clapboard church, wearing a simple Sunday dress, squinting into the sun. She was smiling, but it was an uncertain smile, the smile of someone not used to being photographed. Written on the back in pencil. Quote 62. Quote 63, Dempsey said. Quote 64. Quote 65, Estelle whispered. Quote 66. Quote 67, Dempsey confirmed. Quote 68. Over the next 72 hours, the story emerged piece by piece. The young woman's fingerprints were on file with the War Department. She'd worked briefly at a defense plant in early 1942. Her name was Vivian Marsh, age 21, originally from rural West Virginia. She'd come to Pittsburgh in late 1941 seeking war work, like thousands of others. She'd lived in a boarding house on the south side, worked the assembly line at a munitions plant. Then, in August 1942, she'd simply vanished. The boarding house owner had reported her missing, but with so many transient workers moving through the city, the police hadn't pursued it aggressively. She'd been classified as a probable runaway or voluntary departure. But Vivian hadn't run away. She'd been taken. As physicians worked to stabilize Vivian at Mercy Hospital, slowly reducing the sedatives and allowing her to regain consciousness, FBI agents interrogated Dorothea Claiborne. Initially, she refused to speak. Then, when confronted with the evidence, the forged prescriptions, the locked room, the near-dead young woman, she broke down and told a story that sickened everyone who heard it. Dorothea Claiborne had a nephew named Raymond Dietz. Raymond was 38 years old, a machinist at a tool and die shop. He'd been classified 4F, unfit for military service, due to a psychological evaluation that found him emotionally unstable. Raymond was obsessed with Vivian Marsh. He'd met her at a USO dance in July 1942. She danced with him once, politely, then avoided him the rest of the night. Raymond interpreted this as coyness, as playing hard to get. He began following her, learned her schedule, her routines. On August 14, 1942, he'd abducted her off the street as she walked home from her shift. He'd chloroformed her, driven her to his Aunt Dorothea's house in Homewood, and locked her in the upstairs bedroom. Raymond had told his Aunt Dorothea that Vivian was his fiancée, that she was mentally unstable, that she needed to be kept safe until they could be married. Dorothea, who lived alone and depended on Raymond for financial support, had believed him, or convinced herself she believed him. Raymond visited the house regularly, bringing food, bringing Vivian clothes and personal items, spending hours in that locked room. He told Dorothea that Vivian had to be kept sedated for her own safety, that she was suicidal, that the doctors had prescribed the medication. Raymond had obtained the first few bottles of chloral hydrate through an acquaintance who worked at a hospital, petty theft from the pharmacy stockroom. But that source dried up when the acquaintance was drafted. Raymond then pressured Dorothea to get the medication. She'd remembered Dr. Whitmore from her own treatment years earlier, remembered how he wrote prescriptions, what his signature looked like. Raymond had coached her on how to forge the prescriptions convincingly. She'd been obtaining the chloral hydrate for 9 months, bringing it to Raymond, who dosed Vivian daily to keep her compliant and submissive. When FBI agents arrested Raymond Dietz at his workplace on May 17th, he showed no remorse. He insisted that Vivian loved him, that she'd wanted to be with him, that he was protecting her from the corrupting influences of the city. He claimed they were essentially married in the eyes of God. The agents found a cache of letters in his apartment, letters he'd written to Vivian but never sent, letters that detailed his obsession, his fantasies, his delusions of their future together. Vivian Marsh regained consciousness on May 20th, 4 days after her rescue. Her condition was critical: kidney damage from prolonged dehydration, liver damage from chloral hydrate toxicity, severe muscle atrophy from months of near-complete immobility. Her teeth had begun to decay from lack of care. Her skin showed pressure sores from lying in bed for so long. The physicians at Mercy Hospital said she would survive physically, but the psychological damage was incalculable. When she was strong enough to speak, her voice a barely audible rasp from disuse, she gave her statement to Agent Dempsey. Estelle wasn't present for that, but Dempsey later told her some of what Vivian had said, the parts that were necessary for Estelle to understand the full scope of what her vigilance had interrupted. Vivian's story began on August 14th, 1942. She'd been walking home from her shift at the Westinghouse plant, tired, looking forward to dinner and a bath. It was a Friday evening, still light out, the streets busy with people. She'd taken her usual route down Carson Street, then cutting through a side street to reach her boarding house. She never made it. A car pulled up alongside her. A man got out, later identified as Raymond Dietz, and asked for directions to an address. As Vivian leaned toward the car to point the way, he'd clamped a chloroform-soaked rag over her face. She'd struggled, tried to scream, but the chemical overwhelmed her consciousness within seconds. The last thing she remembered before waking up in that locked bedroom was the smell. Sickly sweet, chemical, suffocating. When she regained consciousness, she had no idea how much time had passed. Hours? Days? The room was unfamiliar. The bed beneath her was strange. Her head pounded with a vicious headache. She tried to sit up and immediately vomited. When she tried to stand, her legs wouldn't support her. Whether from the chloroform or from being drugged while unconscious, she didn't know. The door was locked. She pounded on it, screamed until her voice gave out. No one came. Eventually, she collapsed back onto the bed, terrified and confused. Night fell. She could tell from the dimming light through the curtained window, though she couldn't see outside because the window was nailed shut. She spent that first night in absolute terror, convinced she was going to die in this strange room. The next morning, or what she assumed was morning, time had become fluid and unreliable, the door opened. A man entered. Raymond Dietz, though she didn't know his name yet. He was carrying a tray with food and water. He set it on the nightstand, pulled up the chair, and sat down. "Good morning, darling," he said, as if this were the most normal situation in the world. "I hope you slept well. I brought you breakfast. You must be hungry." Vivian had demanded to know where she was, why he'd taken her, what he wanted. Raymond had smiled. Dempsey said Vivian described the smile as the most terrifying thing about him, because it was so genuinely pleased, so utterly disconnected from the horror of the situation. Raymond said. Vivian insisted she'd never agreed to anything, that he was insane, that people would be looking for her. Raymond had shaken his head sadly. The world out there is dangerous, especially for a young woman alone. The war, the violence, the corruption. But here, you're protected. I'll take care of you. You'll see. Once you calm down and think clearly, you'll understand. We're going to be very happy together. He'd left, locking the door behind him. Vivian had tried to escape, tested the window, examined the door for weaknesses, looked for anything she could use as a weapon or tool. But there was nothing. The room had been carefully prepared. No sharp objects, no heavy items, nothing that could break glass or pry wood. Even the lamp was bolted to the nightstand. Raymond came every day, sometimes twice a day. He brought food, simple things, sandwiches and soup and crackers, and water. He talked to her for hours, monologues about their future life together, about how they would be married, about the children they would have, about the house they would eventually buy. He spoke as if everything were already settled, as if Vivian's screams and tears and pleas were just temporary confusion that would pass once she adjusted to her new life. After the first week, Vivian tried refusing food. She thought if she could make herself sick enough, he would be forced to take her to a hospital, where she could escape or at least be seen by others. But Raymond solved that problem by bringing chloral hydrate syrup. "The doctor prescribed this to help you sleep," he'd said, holding up the bottle. __quote_76__. Vivian refused. Raymond had simply waited until she fell asleep from exhaustion, then forced the liquid down her throat. She woke hours later, groggy and disoriented, her mouth tasting of bitter medicine. After that, it became routine. Raymond dosed her daily, sometimes multiple times a day. The chloral hydrate kept her in a perpetual fog, unable to think clearly, unable to plan escape, unable to do anything but drift in and out of drugged sleep. Time dissolved. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Vivian lost track. The chloral hydrate made her memory unreliable. She would wake up and not know if it was morning or evening, if a day had passed or a week. Sometimes Raymond was there, talking to her, stroking her hair, calling her __quote_77__. Sometimes he would lie down beside her on the bed, fully clothed, and just hold her while she drifted in and out of consciousness. He never sexually assaulted her. That was one small mercy. But the possessiveness was perhaps worse in its way. The absolute conviction that she belonged to him, that this was love. Vivian tried to resist. She tried to stay awake, to refuse the medicine, to fight. But Raymond was patient and methodical. He would withhold food until she was weak with hunger, then offer a sandwich along with the medicine. Or he would simply pin her down and force it into her mouth. There was no winning, no escape. Gradually, she stopped fighting. It was easier to just take the medicine, drift away, let the hours pass in chemical stupor. By the time the FBI broke down the door in May 1943, Vivian had been imprisoned for 9 months. She'd lost 30 pounds from her already slight frame. Her muscles had atrophied from lack of use. She could barely walk at first. Her mind was foggy from prolonged drugging. She had trouble forming coherent sentences, trouble remembering basic facts about her own life before the abduction. The physicians at Mercy Hospital worked to detoxify her body from the chloral hydrate, slowly reducing the dose to prevent dangerous withdrawal symptoms. Physical therapists helped her rebuild muscle strength, but the psychological damage was beyond what medicine could address. Vivian had nightmares every night, waking up screaming, convinced she was back in that locked room. She couldn't tolerate being alone in any room with a closed door. She panicked if anyone touched her unexpectedly. Loud noises made her cry. The smell of certain foods, the things Raymond had brought her, made her vomit. A psychiatrist from Western Psychiatric Hospital, Dr. Adelaide Brennan, was assigned to Vivian's case. Dr. Brennan visited daily, trying to help Vivian process the trauma. But as she later testified, Vivian was deeply broken. The 9 months of captivity, of chemical subjugation, of having her reality denied while her captor insisted they were living a normal domestic life. It had shattered something fundamental in her psyche. She can't trust her own perceptions anymore, Dr. Brennan explained to Estelle during one conversation after the trial. Raymond Dietz told her over and over that what was happening was normal, was loving, was what she wanted. He denied her reality so consistently that she started to doubt her own mind. Even after rescue, even after understanding intellectually that he was insane and she was a victim, part of her still questions whether she somehow caused this, whether she gave him the wrong impression at that dance, whether she failed to make her refusal clear enough. It's a form of psychological torture, and the scars may never fully heal. The case went to federal court in August 1943. United States versus Raymond Dietz and Dorothea Claiborne. The charges against Raymond were severe. Kidnapping across state lines. Vivian's initial arrival in Pittsburgh from West Virginia provided federal jurisdiction. Assault, unlawful imprisonment, and administering drugs without consent with intent to facilitate a felony. Each count carried substantial prison time. Dorothea faced charges as an accessory after the fact and prescription fraud. Lesser charges, but still serious. The trial lasted 2 weeks and attracted significant press attention. The courtroom in the federal building on Liberty Avenue was packed every day. Journalists from all the local papers, curious spectators, law students from the University of Pittsburgh, and courthouse regulars who attended trials for entertainment. Judge Cornelius Hathaway presided, a stern man in his 60s known for running an efficient courtroom and handing down harsh sentences. The prosecution was led by Assistant United States Attorney Margaret Chen, one of the few women prosecutors in the federal system. She was methodical and relentless, building her case piece by piece like a bricklayer constructing a wall. She began with the evidence of abduction, Vivian's testimony about that August evening, the location where she was taken, eyewitness accounts from people who'd seen a man helping an apparently unconscious woman into a car. One witness, a delivery man making rounds in that area, had even noted the license plate number and reported it to police. But the report had been filed and forgotten, just another piece of paper in an overwhelmed system. Chen entered into evidence the physical items recovered from 847 Warwick Street. The deadbolt installed on the bedroom door, the 17 empty chloral hydrate bottles, the chamber pot, the sparse furnishings that demonstrated the room's function as a cell rather than a bedroom. She showed photographs of Vivian's condition when found: pale, emaciated, barely conscious. She had Dr. Marcus Weinstein from Mercy Hospital testify about the medical findings: the chloral hydrate toxicity, the malnutrition, the muscle atrophy, the organ damage. Dr. Weinstein estimated that without intervention, Vivian would have died within 2 weeks. Then came the psychiatric testimony. Dr. Adelaide Brennan from Western Psychiatric Hospital described the psychological damage, the nightmares, the dissociation, the inability to trust her own perceptions, the complex trauma that would likely plague Vivian for the rest of her life. Dr. Brennan had treated many trauma victims, including veterans with shell shock, but she testified that Vivian's case was among the most severe she'd encountered. Quote 80. Dr. Brennan explained to the jury. Quote 81. Prosecutor Chen then called Estelle Vogel to the stand. Estelle wore her best dress, navy blue with white collar, and kept her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Chen walked her through the timeline. The first prescription in March, the second in April, the third in May. How each one had raised her suspicion. Why chloral hydrate in those quantities was abnormal. Her decision to call Dr. Whitmore. The conversation that led to FBI involvement. Chen said. Estelle paused, choosing her words carefully. The defense attorney for Raymond Dietz was a court-appointed lawyer named Arnold Fisk, an overworked public defender who had drawn the short straw in this case. He tried to build an insanity defense, calling psychiatrists who testified that Dietz suffered from erotomania, a delusional disorder characterized by the belief that another person is in love with them. The psychiatrist described how erotomania could lead sufferers to misinterpret casual kindness as romantic interest, to construct elaborate fantasies about relationships that didn't exist. Dr. Harold Pendleton, the defense psychiatrist, testified that in his examination of Raymond Dietz, he found a man completely convinced that Vivian Marsh had signaled romantic interest at that USO dance, that her subsequent avoidance was merely shyness, that their enforced cohabitation was the beginning of a marriage she secretly desired but was too timid to acknowledge. In Mr. Dietz's mind, Dr. Pendleton explained, he was not committing a crime. He was rescuing Miss Marsh from the dangerous, immoral influences of the city and beginning their life together. The delusion is complete. He genuinely cannot understand why she didn't respond positively to his actions. But Prosecutor Chen dismantled this defense methodically. Yes, Dietz might be delusional about Vivian's feelings, but his actions demonstrated clear awareness that what he was doing was wrong. He'd chloroformed her to abduct her, an action that shows he knew she wouldn't come willingly. He'd locked her in a room, showing he knew she would try to leave. He'd kept her drugged, demonstrating he understood that in her normal state of mind, she would resist and attempt escape. And he'd enlisted his aunt to forge prescriptions and obtain the drugs illegally, which proved he knew the medical establishment wouldn't sanction what he was doing. Chen argued. Vivian herself testified on the 7th day of the trial. She was wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair, still too weak to walk long distances. She wore a simple gray dress that hung on her thin frame. Her hair had been cut short in the hospital. It had been too matted and damaged to salvage. She looked young and fragile and utterly broken. Chen questioned her gently, leading her through the story. The abduction, the captivity, Raymond's daily visits, the forced drugging, the months of being told her reality was false. Vivian's voice was barely audible, even with the courtroom absolutely silent. Several jurors were crying openly. Estelle, sitting in the gallery, felt tears streaming down her own face. The defense's cross-examination was brief. Fisk knew better than to attack a sympathetic victim too harshly. It would only make the jury hate his client more. He asked a few gentle questions about whether Vivian remembered being violent or threatening toward Raymond, whether she recalled making any statements that could be interpreted as consent. Vivian answered each question with a quiet no. Fisk thanked her and let her go. Raymond Dietz himself testified, against his lawyer's advice. It was a disaster. He sat in the witness box and insisted, with absolute conviction, that he and Vivian were in love, that everything he'd done was to protect her, that she would have thanked him once she came to her senses. He showed no remorse, no understanding that he'd committed crimes. When the prosecutor asked him if he understood that Vivian had never consented to any of this, he smiled. That same terrifying smile Vivian had described, and said, quote, "The jury deliberated 4 hours. Guilty on all counts." Raymond Dietz showed no reaction when the verdict was read. Dorothea Claiborne, who'd sat through the trial weeping quietly, collapsed and had to be helped from the courtroom by marshals. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Judge Hathaway showed no mercy. Raymond Dietz, 30 years in federal prison, to be served at USP Lewisburg. Dorothea Claiborne, 10 years in federal prison at the Federal Correctional Institution, Alderson, West Virginia. Both would be eligible for parole review after serving 2/3 of their sentences, but the judge's recommendation was clear: deny parole for the maximum period allowed by law. The newspapers covered the trial extensively. Quote, 94, quote, screamed the Pittsburgh Press headline. Quote, 95, quote, reported the Post-Gazette. Estelle's role was mentioned. Alert pharmacist breaks kidnapping case. For a few weeks, she received letters from strangers thanking her, praising her vigilance. The Pennsylvania Pharmaceutical Association sent her a commendation. She filed it away and tried to return to normal life. But nothing was normal anymore. Vivian Marsh survived physically, but was shattered psychologically. She spent months in psychiatric care at Western Psychiatric Hospital. Her family came from West Virginia to take her home, hoping familiar surroundings might help her heal, but she never fully recovered. She suffered nightmares, panic attacks, an inability to trust anyone. The doctors tried everything available at the time: therapy, medication, constant supervision, but the trauma ran too deep. In March 1944, less than a year after her rescue, Vivian's mother contacted Agent Dempsey with devastating news. Vivian had taken her own life at the family home. She left a note expressing her pain and inability to recover. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 97, underscore, underscore. The news reached Estelle through a phone call from Agent Dempsey. She had to sit down, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She'd saved the young woman's life, gotten her out of that locked room, stopped the drugging, brought her captors to justice. But she hadn't been able to save Vivian from the invisible wounds, the damage that had been done to her mind and spirit. The knowledge ate at her. Should she have acted sooner? After the second prescription, instead of waiting for the third, could Vivian have been rescued weeks earlier, before the trauma had accumulated to unbearable levels? Then, in October 1944, more terrible news. Dorothea Claiborne had taken her own life in her cell at the Federal Correctional Institution at Alderson, West Virginia. It happened late at night when guards were between rounds. She left no written note, but other inmates reported that she'd been consumed by guilt in the months since her conviction, that she'd spoken obsessively about the young woman she'd helped imprison, that she couldn't live with what she'd enabled. The guilt had become unbearable. Estelle learned this from Agent Dempsey, who called to inform her as a courtesy, knowing she'd want to know how the case had concluded. After hanging up, she sat in the pharmacy's back office during her lunch break and allowed herself to cry. 2 lives lost. 2 women destroyed by Raymond Dietz's obsession and delusions. And Raymond himself was alive, serving his sentence in a federal prison, eating 3 meals a day, breathing air, existing in the world. It seemed profoundly unjust that the perpetrator survived while his victims, both direct and indirect, did not. Morton died in November 1944. He'd been crossing the street near his workplace, intoxicated in the middle of the afternoon, and was struck by a delivery truck. The impact was fatal. He died before the ambulance arrived. Estelle felt very little at the funeral beyond a vague sadness for a life wasted. Their marriage had been dead for years. His actual death was just a formality, the legal end to what had emotionally concluded long ago. She sold the house on Ellsworth Avenue, too many rooms, too many memories, most of them hollow, and moved into a smaller apartment above a bakery on Forbes Avenue. The smell of fresh bread in the mornings became a small comfort. She continued working at Hartley's Pharmacy. Work was her anchor, her purpose, the thing that gave structure and meaning to her days. The war ended in August 1945. Victory celebrations filled the streets. The steel mills would continue running, but at peacetime levels. Defense plants closed. Workers dispersed. Pittsburgh began its slow transition back to normal life, though normal would never quite be the same. Estelle kept working. She was 44 years old, a widow, childless, alone. The pharmacy was her family. Over the following years, she thought often about that case, about the 3 prescriptions, the forged signatures, the locked room on Warwick Street, about Vivian Marsh's pale face on the hospital bed, about Dorothea Claiborne's trembling hands, about Raymond Dietz's cold, delusional eyes during the trial. She thought about what she could have done differently, should have done differently. The questions never stopped. In 1953, Raymond Dietz came up for parole review. Estelle wrote a letter to the parole board urging them to deny release. She detailed the case, reminded them of Vivian's suicide, Dorothea's suicide, the lives destroyed. The parole board denied Dietz's petition. He wouldn't be eligible again until 1963. Estelle continued working at Hartley's Pharmacy through the 1950s. She became an institution in Oakland, a familiar and trusted face behind the counter. She saved several lives over those years, recognizing dangerous drug interactions that physicians had missed, identifying prescription forgeries before they could cause harm, and once, memorably, talking with a distraught teenager who had come in asking questions about sleeping pills that raised immediate red flags. Estelle had recognized the desperation in the young person's eyes, gently asked the right questions, and called the teenager's parents and a crisis counselor. Years later, that same person, now an adult, now thriving, returned to thank her. She was vigilant, always. She asked questions. She paid attention. Because she remembered March 1943. She remembered those chloral hydrate prescriptions. She remembered what inattention could cost and what vigilance could prevent. In 1963, Raymond Dietz came up for parole again. This time, Estelle was 62 years old and no longer working. She'd retired the previous year. But she wrote another letter, as detailed and forceful as the first. The parole board denied his petition again. Dietz would serve his full sentence. He was released in August 1973, having served exactly 30 years. Estelle learned about it from a newspaper article. She was 72 by then, living in a modest retirement home in Squirrel Hill. When she read that Dietz was free, she felt a wave of cold dread. He was out in the world again. Older, but still the same man. What would he do now? She never found out. Raymond Dietz died in February 1974, 6 months after his release. Advanced liver disease, the result of years of alcohol abuse that had begun in prison and accelerated after his release. He died in a charity hospital in Erie, Pennsylvania, with no visitors, no family at his bedside. Estelle read his obituary in the newspaper. Just a few lines, no photo, listing his death and surviving relatives. None. She felt nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction, not even vindication. Just emptiness. His death didn't resurrect Vivian or bring peace to Dorothea's memory. It changed nothing about what had happened, didn't undo any of the damage he'd caused. The years continued to pass. Estelle lived quietly, saw few people. She had no close friends, no living family. Once a year, on May 16th, the anniversary of Vivian's rescue, she visited Homewood and walked past 847 Warwick Street. The house had been torn down in the 1960s, replaced by a vacant lot. She stood there for a few minutes, remembering. Then she left. In 1985, at age 84, Estelle was contacted by a journalist writing a book about famous criminal cases in Pennsylvania history. He wanted to interview her about the Vivian Marsh kidnapping. Estelle agreed. She told him everything she remembered: the prescriptions, the investigation, the trial, the suicides, the aftermath. The journalist asked if she considered herself a hero. "No," Estelle said. "I just did my job. I noticed something wrong and I acted. That's not heroism. That's basic human decency. The real question is why so few people bother to notice, bother to act." The book was published in 1987. It included a chapter on the Marsh case, with several pages devoted to Estelle's role. She received the book in the mail, read the chapter once, and put it away. She didn't need a book to remember. The memories were always there, vivid and undiminished. Estelle Vogel died on January 12, 1990, 3 months before what would have been her 89th birthday. She died in her sleep at the retirement home, peacefully, according to the staff. She had no next of kin, no heirs. Her modest savings went to a scholarship fund for pharmacy students at the University of Pittsburgh. Her funeral was attended by a handful of former colleagues and neighbors who remembered her not just as a pharmacist, but as someone who had cared enough to act when others might have looked away. She was buried in Homewood Cemetery, not far from where Vivian Marsh's memorial stone stood. Vivian's body had been taken back to West Virginia for burial, but Pittsburgh had placed a commemorative marker in her honor in 1946. But Estelle's story doesn't end with her death, because stories like hers ripple forward. The journalist's book was read by law enforcement officers, social workers, healthcare professionals. It became a teaching case in pharmacy ethics courses about the importance of vigilance, of questioning patterns, of trusting professional instincts. Estelle Vogel's decision to investigate 3 suspicious prescriptions became an example of how one person's attention and courage can prevent tragedy, or at least limit its scope. Yet the questions remain. What if Estelle had acted after the first prescription? Could Vivian have been saved sooner, before months of trauma had accumulated? What if Dr. Whitmore had better secured his prescription pads, making forgery more difficult? What if the police had taken Vivian's disappearance more seriously in 1942, instead of dismissing her as just another transient worker who'd moved on? What if Raymond Dietz's psychological instability had been recognized and treated earlier? These questions have no answers. They're the eternal quote 101 that haunt every tragedy. But they also point to a larger truth, that preventing harm requires constant vigilance from everyone: individuals, institutions, communities. It requires people like Estelle Vogel, who notice when something doesn't add up, who ask uncomfortable questions, who refuse to look away. The case file sits in the National Archives, documented in meticulous detail. Agent Harold Dempsey's reports, Dr. Whitmore's testimony, Estelle's ledger entries with those 3 copied prescriptions, Vivian's statement from her hospital bed, photographs of the locked room on Warwick Street, Raymond Dietz's unsent letters, Dorothea Claiborne's suicide note. Actually, she left none, which says something in itself. Pittsburgh has changed. The steel mills have closed. Oakland has gentrified. Hartley's Pharmacy is long gone, replaced by a Starbucks. The generation that lived through World War II is mostly gone too. But some stories persist because they matter, because they teach us something essential about human nature, both its capacity for cruelty and its capacity for attention, for care, for moral courage. Estelle Vogel wasn't a superhero. She was a pharmacist who paid attention to details, who trusted her professional judgment, who followed through when something seemed wrong. She saved one life, though she couldn't prevent that life from ending anyway. She couldn't save Dorothea Claiborne from guilt-driven despair. She couldn't undo what Raymond Dietz had done. But she tried. She acted. And in a world where evil often succeeds because good people do nothing, that attempt matters. There's a bench in Shenley Park, installed in 2005 by the University of Pittsburgh College of Pharmacy. A small plaque reads, "In memory of Estelle Vogel, Pharm D, 1901 to 1990. Pharmacist, educator, guardian. Her vigilance saved lives. Students sit there between classes, eating lunch, checking phones, unaware of the story. But the story is there, embedded in Pittsburgh's history, waiting to be remembered, waiting to teach. Because the lesson of Estelle Vogel isn't about dramatic heroism. It's about something quieter and more sustainable. The daily practice of attention. Noticing. Questioning. Caring enough to act. In a world that constantly pressures us to mind our own business, to not make waves, to accept things at face value, Estelle's story reminds us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is refuse to look away. May 16, 1943. The day Vivian Marsh was rescued from 847 Warwick Street. The day Estelle Vogel's decision to investigate 3 prescriptions came to fruition. The day that proved one person paying attention can change outcomes, even if they can't prevent all pain, all loss, all tragedy. The day that marked Estelle for the rest of her life, giving her both purpose and burden. She carried that burden until she died. The knowledge that she'd done what she could, but that it hadn't been enough. That Vivian had died anyway. That Dorothea had died anyway. That all her vigilance and courage had prevented neither suicide. But she also carried the knowledge that she'd tried, that she'd cared enough to act, that she'd refused to simply fill those prescriptions and look the other way. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that one person can save everyone, but that trying to save someone, anyone, is never wasted effort. That the world needs people who notice, who question, who care. People who wear white coats and stand behind pharmacy counters and pay attention to patterns that don't quite make sense. People who trust their instincts. People who make the uncomfortable phone call, ask the difficult question, follow through even when it would be easier to shrug and move on. Estelle Vogel was one of those people. There should be more of them. There need to be more of them. Because tragedies like Vivian Marsh's happen in every city, every era. The specific details change, different drugs, different methods, different victims, but the underlying dynamic remains constant. Predators exist, and they rely on everyone else being too busy, too distracted, too afraid to notice. They count on institutional indifference, on bureaucratic inertia, on the human tendency to not want to get involved. Estelle refused that tendency. She got involved. She noticed 3 prescriptions that didn't make sense, and instead of rationalizing them away, she investigated. And because she investigated, Vivian Marsh got 9 more months of life, however damaged and painful those months were. Dorothea Claiborne had to face what she'd enabled, which drove her to suicide, but at least meant she couldn't help destroy anyone else. Raymond Dietz went to prison instead of continuing to hold Vivian captive indefinitely, drugging her into a living death. It wasn't a happy ending. There was no happy ending possible once Raymond Dietz abducted Vivian in August 1942. The damage was done. But Estelle limited the damage. She prevented the worst-case scenario. And she demonstrated that ordinary people, doing ordinary jobs, have extraordinary power when they choose to exercise it. The story of Estelle Vogel and Vivian Marsh is a story about vigilance, about professional ethics, about the weight of responsibility that comes with certain kinds of knowledge, about the way trauma echoes through time, affecting not just victims but rescuers, witnesses, everyone caught in its gravitational pull. About the questions that never get answered, the guilt that never fully releases, the what-ifs that haunt us. But it's also a story about hope, because for every Raymond Dietz, there are people like Estelle Vogel. For every Dorothea Claiborne who enables evil through weakness or fear, there are professionals who refuse to look away. For every tragedy, there are moments when intervention is possible, when someone paying attention can change the trajectory. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 1943. A city at war, churning with industry and anxiety. A pharmacist behind a counter. 3 prescriptions for chloral hydrate. A decision to investigate instead of ignoring instinct. And a life saved, however briefly, however incompletely. That's the story. That's the legacy. That's what Estelle Vogel left behind. Not a perfect rescue, not a triumphant ending, but the evidence that paying attention matters, that asking questions matters, that refusing to accept easy explanations matters, that one person acting on professional conscience and moral courage can, in fact, make a difference. The world didn't become safer because of what Estelle did. Pittsburgh didn't transform into a utopia. Crime continued. Tragedy continued. But one woman who would have died in that locked room in 1943 didn't die until 1944. One predator who would have continued his crimes went to prison instead. One pattern of prescription fraud was detected and stopped. Small victories, perhaps, but not insignificant. Never insignificant. Because what Estelle Vogel proved is that we're not helpless, that we don't have to accept evil as inevitable, that paying attention, acting on conscience, following through on instinct, these seemingly small choices accumulate into something larger, into resistance, into protection, into the thin line between a world where predators operate unchecked and a world where someone notices, someone cares, someone acts. And as long as there are people like Estelle Vogel, pharmacists, teachers, neighbors, co-workers, any of us who choose to notice, there's hope. Not for perfection, not for the elimination of evil, but for moments when evil is interrupted, when victims are rescued, when justice is served, however imperfectly. That's the lesson of March through May 1943, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's what the bench in Schenley Park commemorates. That's what Estelle Vogel's life demonstrated. Not heroism, just attention, just care, just the refusal to look away. And sometimes, that's everything.